Between blue seas and steep mountains in a fragmented and luminous territory, a civilization was born that forever transformed the way human beings think, govern, and create. Greece was not an empire in the Roman sense or a unified power under a single banner. It was a constellation of scattered peoples, of islands, valleys, and ports that, over the centuries, shaped a common spirit, the Hellenic ethos, a way of understanding freedom, beauty, and knowledge that still defines the essence of the West. Its jagged shores, open to the Aegean Sea, were a constant invitation to the journey. From the Cyclades Islands to the Peloponnese Peninsula, the ancient Greeks lived facing the sea. Water was their way and their border, their sustenance and their threat. Through it, they traded, explored, warred, and expanded to the coasts of Asia Minor, southern Italy, and beyond the Mediterranean. In a territory of poor soils and mountains that isolated communities, the sea was the common thread of a civilization that made exchange its strength and navigation its art. At the dawn of the second millennium BC, when Egypt and Mesopotamia had already built empires and monuments, Greece began to take shape as a mosaic of cultures that would inherit the best of the Eastern world and transform it into something new. In Crete, the Minoan civilization developed majestic palaces, colorful frescoes, and flourishing trade that connected the Aegean with the civilizations of the Nile and Euphrates. On the continent, the Mycenaeans erected walled fortresses and wove the legends that would later inspire the Homeric poems. Around them, myths, heroes, and gods began to trace the imaginary of a people destined to endure beyond its borders. The Greek geography, wild and fragmented, favored the independence of its communities. Every valley, every island, and every harbor became a polis, a city-state with its own laws, government, and traditions. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, or Miletus were not simple urban centers, but entire worlds, proud and rivals, united only by language and religion. This political model, based on autonomy and participation, gave rise to concepts such as citizenship, republic, and democracy. In Greece, the idea was born that men could govern themselves, discuss their destiny in assemblies, and decide by word rather than the sword. But Greece was not only political, it was also art, science, and thought. In his temples and sculptures, the perfection of the human form was sought. In its theaters, passions and moral dilemmas were explored. Philosophy was born in their schools, that impulse to ask and reason that would forever change the way human beings face the world. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, centuries later, would embody that search for truth that is not imposed by faith or force, but by reason. The Greek gods, unlike those of the East, did not live in an inaccessible sky. They were a reflection of men. They loved, hated, fought, deceived. They inhabited Mount Olympus, but they walked among mortals. This humanized vision of the universe gave rise to a rich and diverse mythology, which explained the origin of the world, destiny, and natural forces through stories that still survive today in literature and art. Greek religion did not demand dogmas. It was a living relationship between men and the divine, a balance between fear, respect, and celebration. The time of heroes marked the beginning of their identity. Achilles, Ulysses, Jason, Heracles, and many others starred in stories where courage and cunning defined the destiny of men. In his deeds, myth and history merged, creating a model of conduct that exalted arete, excellence, understood as the constant search for improvement. To be Greek was to aspire to that perfection, not as a divine gift, but as a human effort. Over the centuries, Greek civilization went through crises and rebirths. After the Minoan and Mycenaean splendor came darkness, centuries of isolation, oblivion, and silence. But out of that emptiness came a new creative impulse. In the Archaic period, Greece flourished again with force. The polis was born, laws were codified, it expanded throughout the Mediterranean, and a culture that balanced tradition and progress was consolidated. It was a rebirth that would lay the foundations for everything that would come later. The Minoans, the splendor of Crete. Long before Athens or Sparta existed, long before poets sang of the exploits of Achilles or Ulysses, a civilization flourished in the heart of the Aegean Sea. On the island of Crete, surrounded by deep waters and trade routes connecting it to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant, it emerged around 3000 BC. The first great culture of the Greek world, the Minoan civilization. Its name, taken from the legendary King Minos, evokes myths of labyrinths, monsters, and heroes, but behind the legend lies a real advanced and refined society that laid the foundations of Hellenic splendor. The center of this world was Knossos, a palace city that dazzled with its architectural complexity. With more than 1,000 rooms connected by corridors, stairs, and courtyards, Knossos was a labyrinth of stone and color. Its walls were covered with frescoes that showed scenes of daily life, religious processions, and bullfighting games. In them there were no representations of war or violence, but of dance, music, and nature. This absence of war iconography suggests that the Minoans lived in relative peace, protected by the sea and sustained by trade. Sea power was the key to its prosperity. Crete controlled the routes linking the eastern and western Mediterranean, exchanging oil, wine, pottery, and metals. The Minoan ships, with long hulls and high bows, were the fastest of their time. This domination of the sea gave rise to the myth of the Minoan thalassocracy, the kingdom of the sea. According to ancient accounts, Minos himself had been given control of the waters by the gods, ensuring peace and stability in the Aegean. Minoan society was hierarchical but less rigid than others of the same period. At the top was a monarch, probably of a sacred nature, surrounded by priests, artisans, and officials. However, the art suggests a prominent position of women, with female figures depicted as goddesses or priestesses, richly dressed and in poses of authority. Religious rites were centered on fertility, nature, and the bull, a symbol of strength and renewal. The ceremonies included acrobatics on bulls, dances, and offerings in caves or mountaintops, places where the Minoans believed the gods dwelt. Minoan art reflected an exceptional sensitivity. The frescoes of Knossos, Phaistos, and Agia Triada show vivid colors such as reds, blues, and yellows, applied with a technique of great delicacy. The ceramic, ivory, and gold objects reveal a technical and aesthetic mastery comparable to that of Egypt. The human figures, agile and elegant, seem to move with an almost modern grace. Art did not seek to impose, but to celebrate life. In him we can see a love for movement, color, and harmony that would later influence Greek sculpture and painting. Writing was another of his achievements. The Minoans developed a system known as Linear A, not yet deciphered, used for administration and trade. Later, the Mycenaeans would adapt this system to their own language, giving rise to Linear B, a direct ancestor of archaic Greek. The existence of a complex bureaucracy and administrative seals shows that the palaces functioned as political, economic, and religious centers, controlling the production and distribution of goods. Trade with Egypt and the Near East left a deep cultural imprint. From Egypt, they adopted artistic techniques, decorative motifs, and possibly religious elements. In exchange, they exported oil, wine, and ceramics. Tablets found in the Nile Delta record the presence of Cretan traders in Egyptian ports, confirming the extent of their trade network. Crete was a meeting point between East and West, a crossroads where ideas and products merged into a single culture. But the Minoan splendor did not last forever. Around 1450 BC, in 400 BC, the palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were destroyed almost simultaneously. For a long time, it was thought that a natural cataclysm, perhaps the eruption of the Thera volcano, had brought about its ruin. The explosion, one of the most powerful in history, spewed ash across the Aegean and generated tsunamis that swept away the coasts. However, archaeological studies suggest that the eruption, while devastating, was not enough on its own to wipe out civilization. The evidence also points to invasions or internal conflicts. After the destruction, Knossos was rebuilt and subsisted for a short time, but under a new influence, that of the Mycenaeans of the mainland, who took control of the island. The remains of Linear B found in Crete confirm the presence of this new warrior elite, who absorbed part of the Minoan culture and integrated it into their own world. The ancient sea power of the Cretans slowly faded, and with it one of the most enigmatic chapters of antiquity disappeared. Even so, the memory of Crete survived in myths. Later Greeks recounted that King Minos had ordered a labyrinth to be built to enclose the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature born from the union of his wife Pasiphae with a sacred bull. Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, and his son Icarus symbolized human ambition and its punishment, flying too close to the sun. These stories, handed down by poets and playwrights, were echoes of a real civilization whose power and mystery were etched in the memory of the Hellenic world. The crumbling walls of Knossos, the red columns of the palace, and the paintings that still retain their brilliance under the Cretan light are the last witnesses of a society that, without armies or conquests, achieved greatness through art, commerce, and imagination. Their influence would persist for centuries, in the form of the myths that gave rise to the identity of Greece, and in the idea that even on an island lost in the seas, the seed of an immortal civilization could be born. The Mycenaeans, the first Greek heroes, in the hills of the Peloponnese, surrounded by Cyclopean walls and bathed in the golden sun of the Aegean, stood the fortresses of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, there between the 16th and 12th centuries BC. A powerful and warlike civilization flourished that would mark the dawn of heroic Greece. The Mycenaeans, partial heirs of Minoan splendor, but of a very different spirit, were the first Greeks in the full sense. They spoke an archaic form of the Hellenic language, practiced rituals that would later inspire the Olympian religion, and forged the legends that Homer would turn into immortal epics. Their world was one of palace fortresses, centers of power and administration where the Wainacs, sovereigns of almost divine authority, reigned. Mycenae, the most famous, dominated the trade routes of the Peloponnese and extended its influence to the Aegean Sea and Asia Minor. The monumental Lion's Gate, which still guards the entrance to its Acropolis, is testament to its grandeur and its obsession with security. Its walls, formed by blocks of stone so enormous that tradition attributed them to giants, defended a warrior aristocracy accustomed to war and intrigue. Mycenaean society was hierarchical and disciplined. At the top was the king, surrounded by officials, scribes, and soldiers. The linear B tablets, deciphered in the 20th century, reveal a meticulous system of administration: inventories of metals, oil, wine, and weapons, record of offerings to the gods, and lists of workers. Unlike the peaceful Minoans, the Mycenaeans lived in an environment of competition and conflict. His art and architecture reflect a world where strength was the measure of power. The army occupied a central place in Mycenaean life. The warriors wore helmets made of boar's tusks, hardened leather shields, and bronze swords. The iconography of ceramics and frescoes shows chariots and battle scenes. Military dominance allowed the Mycenaeans to extend their influence to the Aegean islands, the coasts of Anatolia, and even Cyprus. Archaeology confirms the existence of Mycenaean enclaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean, suggesting a network of colonies, or at least exchanges sustained by military power. Contact with the Minoans of Crete was decisive. After the destruction of the Minoan palaces around 1450 BC, in the 1st century BCE, the Mycenaeans occupied the island and adopted many of its cultural achievements. From them they took writing, artistic motifs, and certain religious rites, although reinterpreted under their martial spirit. Where the Minoans had painted processions and flowers, the Mycenaeans depicted weapons, hunts, and scenes of conquest. It was the same sea, but a new character, pragmatic, expansionist, proud of its warrior lineage. The riches of Mycenae's royal tombs reveal the splendor of its elite. Excavations led by Heinrich Schliemann in the late 19th century uncovered gold masks, jewelry, decorated swords, and precious vases. The most famous, the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, became a symbol of this civilization. Although we now know that its dating predates the legendary king, its discovery confirmed the existence of a culture as rich as the Homeric descriptions. Mycenaean gold, mined or acquired through trade and war, shone as an emblem of status and faith in a life after death. The Mycenaean gods anticipated the pantheon that would later dominate Greece. Names such as Zeus, Poseidon, or Hera already appear on the tablets of Linear B. The religion combined the veneration of natural divinities with sacrifices and offerings intended to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. The palaces also served as temples, where priests guarded sacred treasures and held ceremonies in honor of the city's protective gods. The king, as an intermediary between men and gods, embodied the stability of the cosmos. Legend and history merge in this period. The memory of the Mycenaean kingdoms and their conflicts inspired Homer's epic poems centuries later. Mycenae became the throne of Agamemnon, Argos in the land of Diomedes, Pylos the home of Nestor, and Sparta in the kingdom of Menelaus. The Trojan War, narrated in the Iliad, is the mythical synthesis of that era of heroes. Although its historicity was questioned for centuries, excavations at Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey proved the existence of a fortified city destroyed around 1200 BC, coincides with Mycenaean chronology. Troy was probably one of many cities swept away in the struggles for control of the Aegean trade. Homer's epic, then, was not born of pure myth, but of a collective memory of real wars magnified by poetry. The Mycenaean decline began around 1200 BC in a turbulent period that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean. Entire cities were burned, palaces abandoned, and commerce collapsed. The causes are still a matter of debate. Some historians point to invasions by the peoples of the sea, others speak of internal rebellions or a natural cataclysm. The truth is that the palace system collapsed, dragging with it writing, administration, and much of the technical knowledge. Within a few decades, the civilization that had dominated the Aegean almost completely disappeared. Of its ruin, only walls, tombs, and myths remained. But in those ruins, something deeper persisted. The image of the hero, of the man who defies fate and seeks eternal glory. The Dark Ages. Silence. After the collapse. After the splendor of Mycenae and the deeds that inspired Homer's songs, Greece fell into a long silence. Between the 12th and 9th centuries BC. In the 1st century BC, the Hellenic world experienced a period of darkness in which cities were abandoned, trade died out, and writing disappeared. Archaeologists call it the Dark Ages, not because of the absence of life, but because of the scarcity of vestiges that allow it to be reconstructed. It was a time of retreat and isolation, but also of transformation, in which the seeds of classical Greece slowly began to germinate under the soil of oblivion. The Mycenaean collapse, which occurred around 1200 BC, had dismantled the political and administrative structures that sustained the palace world. The kingdoms disappeared, the Wanaks lost their power, and the great fortifications were left empty. The tablets in Linear B, the last testimony of an advanced bureaucracy, were no longer written. Centralized organization gave way to small, self-sufficient communities that survived on agriculture, livestock, and fishing. In a few years, the splendor of bronze gave rise to a rural and impoverished society. The causes of the collapse are still debated. Some scholars point to invasions by foreign peoples, perhaps the Dorians, tribes from the north who would have introduced the use of iron and displaced the Mycenaean populations to the islands and the coast of Asia Minor. Others suggest a set of factors: natural disasters, economic crisis, internal strife, and exhaustion of the palace system. The truth is that, whatever the reason, Greece lost its connection with the outside world and turned in on itself. Art and architecture reflect that fall. Monumental tombs disappeared, palaces were never rebuilt, and pottery became simpler, with dark tones and geometric motifs. Instead of fresh and gold, repetitive patterns predominated: lines, spirals, triangles. Material culture became austere, functional, but not for that reason lacking in beauty. This style, known as geometric, would become a symbol of a new aesthetic centuries later, a prelude to the order and proportion that would characterize classical Greek art. During this period, writing disappeared completely. Without an administration that needed it, Linear B fell into oblivion, and it would be almost 4 centuries before Greece adopted a new alphabet, this time based on Phoenician. With the loss of writing, history ceased to be recorded on tablets and began to be transmitted orally. Tales of heroes and wars were preserved in the memory of the bards, the Aidos, who recited verses that would later inspire the Iliad and the Odyssey. Thus, while the material world was crumbling, myth became the repository of Greek identity. In the midst of poverty and isolation, migrations played a crucial role. Many Greeks fled the peninsula to the Aegean islands and the Anatolian coast, founding what would become known as Ionian Greece. There, in cities such as Smyrna, Miletus, or Ephesus, traditions and knowledge that would later be essential for cultural renaissance were preserved. These communities maintained contact with the East, preserving the flame of trade and intellectual exchange in a time of continental darkness. Iron weapons, probably introduced by the Dorians, transformed warfare and the economy. Stronger and more accessible than bronze, they allowed tools and weapons to spread among a wider population. With iron came a social change. Power ceased to be concentrated in the old palace aristocracies and began to shift towards a new class of peasant warriors. It was the germ of a more open and competitive society where merit began to replace lineage. Religious rituals survived the ruin of the political system. The Greeks continued to worship the ancient gods, even though their temples were modest stone altars. In caves and mountaintops, they continued to offer sacrifices to Zeus, Poseidon, and Athena. Religion, more than an organized institution, was a bond that maintained the cohesion of dispersed communities. In a time without writing or kings, myths acted as collective memory, shared stories that explained the origin of peoples and the will of the gods. Around the 9th century BC, signs of recovery began to become visible. Trade with the East resumed, cultural exchanges intensified, and villages grew into small urban centers. In this context, the new Greek alphabet emerged, adapted from the Phoenician, which introduced vowel notation for the first time. This advance not only facilitated writing, but also made it possible to set poems and laws in writing. The word, previously entrusted to the memory of the singers, became a lasting testimony. The archaic rebirth, the polis, and the Hellenic spirit. After centuries of darkness and isolation, Greece awoke from its slumber, around the 8th century BC. By the 1st century BC, the valleys, islands, and coasts of the Aegean began to be filled with new life. Villages became cities, trade resurfaced, and the written word once again fixed memory. The archaic period had begun, an era of reconstruction and identity-seeking in which the Greeks reinvented their world. It was then that the polis, the city-state, the center of political, social, and religious life was born, and when the Hellenic spirit was consolidated as a force capable of uniting peoples dispersed under the same culture. The polis was not just a walled city, it was a community of free citizens who shared laws, gods, and customs. Its core was the asti, the urban area, dominated by the Acropolis, the sacred hill where the temples stood, and by the agora, the public square where the inhabitants gathered to trade, debate, and decide common affairs. Around it stretched the chora, the agricultural territory that sustained the city. The polis was at the same time physical space and moral concept, a union of free men who governed themselves and found in civic participation the meaning of life. Each polis developed its own system of government, reflecting its history and geography. Some were monarchies ruled by hereditary kings, others oligarchies dominated by noble families, and in certain cases tyrannies emerged, personal governments that, although authoritarian, often pushed for reforms and public works. But the general trend was towards greater citizen participation. In Athens and other cities in Attica, the old aristocratic privileges began to give way to a system in which citizens could deliberate and vote in assembly. From this process would emerge over time democracy. The expansion of trade brought prosperity and transformation. The Greeks, driven by the scarcity of land and the search for new opportunities, undertook a massive colonization of the Mediterranean. They founded colonies in Asia Minor, southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and even on the coast of present-day France. These colonies, independent policies but united by language and religion, they spread Greek culture from the Black Sea to Gibraltar. Thanks to them, Greece became a common space, a network of cities linked by commercial and spiritual ties. Literacy expanded rapidly. The Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician, made it possible to record not only commercial transactions but also laws, treaties, and, for the first time, poetry. It was in this period that the Homeric poems, handed down for centuries by oral tradition, were finally written. The Iliad and the Odyssey not only preserved the memory of Mycenaean heroes but shaped Greek identity. In them, courage, cunning, and the pursuit of glory became cardinal virtues. Homer offered the Greeks a mirror in which to recognize themselves as a common people, descendants of heroes and protected by the gods of Olympus. Religion played a central role in cultural cohesion. The Olympian gods, led by Zeus, became universal figures throughout the Hellenic world. Each polis had its tutelary divinity, whether it was Athena in Athens, Apollo in Delphi, or Artemis in Ephesus, among others, but they all shared the same myths and rituals. Pan-Hellenic shrines, such as Delphi and Olympia, acted as spiritual and political meeting centers. The Olympic Games were held there, founded in 776 BC, where the Greeks competed not for money, but for honor and glory. These meetings, held in the name of Zeus, were a sacred truce that suspended wars and recalled the unity of the Hellenic people beyond their political borders. Expansion and trade favored the birth of a new social class, the hoplites, citizen soldiers who formed the heavy infantry. Armed with spears, round shields, and bronze breastplates, they fought in close formation, known as the phalanx. This mode of combat required discipline, coordination, and mutual trust. In the phalanx, each man protected the companion on his left with his shield. It was a perfect metaphor for the polis, collective strength over the individual. War ceased to be a privilege of nobles to become a duty and right of citizens. The archaic period was also an age of political and cultural experimentation. In Sparta, the reforms attributed to Lycurgus established a system based on equality among citizens, austerity, and military supremacy. In Athens, tensions between rich and poor led to Solon's laws, which abolished debt slavery and laid the foundation for more equitable justice. In other regions, such as Corinth and Miletus, monumental architecture flourished, and the first natural philosophers, the physicoi, who began to explain the world not through myths but through reason. This rebirth brought with it a new ideal, arete, personal excellence achieved through effort and virtue. Education and participation in public life became the paths to that perfection. The ideal citizen was not the richest or the most powerful, but the one who contributed to the common good. The word, a concept known at the time as the logos, became a political and moral tool, the foundation of debate, persuasion, and justice. Greece had discovered that the power of reason could be as decisive as the sword. As the polis prospered, so did their rivalries. The balance between freedom and independence showed both the greatness and the fragility of the Greek world. But in this archaic period, the Hellenic spirit reached its definitive form, a civilization that valued beauty, measure, speech, and freedom. In the agoras, the first written laws were born. In the temples, art sought harmony of proportions. In ports, merchants extended the boundaries of the known world. Sparta and Athens, two worlds at odds of all the polis that emerged during the Greek Renaissance, two rose above the others, not only because of their power, but because they represented opposing visions of life, politics, and freedom. Sparta and Athens were the two faces of the same civilization, one based on discipline and obedience, the other on reason and words. Between the two was woven the history of the Hellenic world, marked by admiration and conflict, cooperation and rivalry, until the day when their confrontation defined the fate of the whole of Greece. In the heart of the Peloponnese, surrounded by mountains that protected it from the outside, was Sparta, a city without walls, because its citizens were its walls. Founded around the 9th century BC, after the conquest of Laconia, Sparta was organized as a permanent military society. According to tradition, the lawgiver Lycurgus established his political and social system with a single purpose: to create a community of invincible warriors. Education, laws, and economics were subordinated to the ideal of war. The state was everything, the individual just a piece at the service of the collective. Spartan education, the agauge, began at the age of 7. Children were separated from their families and trained in the art of endurance, combat, and obedience. They slept in groups, ate meager portions, and endured the cold and pain without complaint. They learned to steal food but were punished if they were caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy. At the age of 20, they became hoplites and went on to live in the Syssitia, common dining rooms where they shared military life until old age. Women, in contrast to the rest of Greece, enjoyed an unusual freedom. They were physically educated, managed property, and could inherit. Their physical strength was considered essential to begetting strong children. The Spartan political system combined monarchy, oligarchy, and assembly. 2 kings shared military and religious power, while the Gerousia, a council of elders, and the ephors, the magistrates who were appointed annually, controlled administration and discipline. The Apella, an assembly of citizens, ratified decisions, although its power was limited. Society was divided into 3 groups: the Spartiates, full citizens; the Periakos, free inhabitants dedicated to trade and crafts; and the Helots, serfs of Messenian origin who worked the land and sustained the economy. The latter were the invisible basis of the system, forced to feed a people who were almost exclusively engaged in war. The Spartan obsession with stability and internal equality had a price: immobility. The laws prohibited luxury, foreign trade, and the accumulation of wealth. Citizens were to live with austerity and absolute obedience. Sparta did not build majestic temples or produce philosophers or poets, but for centuries it was respected and feared for its discipline. When asked by an ambassador why they didn't fortify the city, a Spartan replied, "Because we have men." To the north, in Attica, Athens, a very different polis, flourished. Open to the Aegean Sea and with the port of Piraeus as its window to the world, Athens became a center of commerce, culture, and thought. Its territory, fertile and accessible, favored exchange and communication. If Sparta symbolized duty and rigidity, Athens embodied curiosity and speech. There, the citizen was not forged in obedience, but in debate. In its early centuries, Athens was ruled by kings and then aristocrats, but social tensions between noble families and the people led to a series of reforms. In the 7th century BC, Draco promulgated the first written legal code, which was famous for its severity. Soon after, Solon introduced more equitable measures. He abolished debt slavery, reorganized society according to wealth, and allowed citizens to participate in the assembly. With his laws, Solon laid the foundations for wider political participation and justice based on reason. In the 6th century BC, in 400 BC, the tyrant Pisistratus took power, but his rule was remembered as a period of prosperity. He beautified the city, promoted agriculture, and promoted the arts. Upon his death, power passed to his sons, whose fall opened the way for Clisthenes' reforms, considered the birth of Athenian democracy. Clisthenes reorganized the citizen body, created the Council of 500, and guaranteed the participation of all free men in the ecclesia, the people's assembly. For the first time in history, a people governed itself by word and vote. Athens developed a culture based on education, art, and thought. The ideal of the enlightened citizen included physical training, but also intellectual training: music, rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. Young people learned not only to fight, but also to debate and reason. The agora became the heart of public life, where merchants, politicians, and philosophers shared space and dialogue. Freedom was understood as active participation in the affairs of the state, and the polis as an extension of the citizen's soul. The differences between Sparta and Athens were not only political, but moral. Sparta valued equality among its citizens, but denied individual freedom. Athens exalted freedom, but tolerated economic inequalities and slavery. One lived closed in on herself, the other open to the sea and change. Both saw the citizen as part of a whole, but with different ends. In Sparta, the common good was imposed on the individual. In Athens, the individual had to contribute to the common good through thought and action. During the 6th century BC, the two powers coexisted in a tense rivalry. Sparta, military leader of the Peloponnese, represented tradition and strength. Athens, progress and innovation. Their paths would cross again and again, first as allies against a common enemy, then as irreconcilable adversaries. The confrontation between the two would not only be a war of armies, but a struggle of ideas, between order and freedom, between the spear and the word, between the silence of discipline and the bustle of democracy. The Greco-Persian Wars, Greece versus the Persian Empire. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, Greece faced a threat that would test its very existence. From the plains of Asia Minor, the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful of its time, extended its dominion over the known world. Ruled by kings who considered themselves chosen by the gods, the empire of Darius I, and later his son Xerxes, stretched from India to Egypt, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. In front of this colossus, a mosaic of small Greek cities, divided and rivaling, seemed hopeless. But from that unequal confrontation would be born one of the most heroic chapters of ancient history, the Greco-Persian Wars, in which Hellenic freedom resisted the absolute power of the East. The conflict began when the Greek polis on the coast of Asia Minor, subdued by Persia, rebelled against imperial rule. In 499 BC, in 400 BC, the Ionian Revolt, led by Miletus, lit the fuse. Athens and Eretria sent ships and soldiers in support of the rebels, attacking the Persian capital of Sardis. Although the revolt was crushed, Darius I swore revenge on the Greek cities that had dared to challenge his authority. His purpose was no longer just to punish a rebellion, but to incorporate Greece into his empire. In 490 BC, a Persian fleet crossed the Aegean and landed on the plain of Marathon, about 40 kilometers from Athens. The Athenians, led by Miltiades, went out to meet him with barely 10,000 hoplites. The Spartans, although summoned, did not arrive in time, stopped by the celebration of a religious festival. The battle seemed lost. The Persians vastly outnumbered the Greeks. However, the closed formation of the hoplite phalanx and Athenian discipline proved decisive. The Greeks attacked from the flanks, disorganizing the Persian troops, and in a few hours achieved an unexpected victory. Marathon became a symbol of resistance in the face of tyranny and the first great triumph of freedom over domination. Legend has it that after the battle, a messenger named Phidippides ran from Marathon to Athens to announce victory before falling dead from the effort. His feat, immortalized by poets, gave rise to the term marathon that still endures. Marathon wasn't just a battle, it was an affirmation of the value of the citizenry, a victory of the free people over absolute power. 10 years later, Persia returned with overwhelming force. The new king, Xerxes I, son of Darius, assembled the largest army the world had ever seen. According to Greek chronicles, more than 2 million men marched westward, although modern historians estimate between 150 and 300,000. The Persian fleet, composed of more than 1,000 ships, accompanied the troops through the Aegean Sea. Greece, fragmented and distrustful, was forced to unite. Athens and Sparta, natural enemies, formed an alliance under the advice of the Hellenic League. The first decisive clash took place in the Thermopylae Gorge in 480 BC. There, King Leonidas I of Sparta, commanding about 7,000 Greeks, attempted to halt the Persian advance in a pass so narrow that it neutralized the enemy's numerical superiority. For 2 days, the Hellenic phalanx resisted all attacks. Finally, a local traitor revealed to Xerxes a path through the mountains that allowed him to surround the defenders. Upon learning that they were surrounded, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies and remained with 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans. They fought to the last man, allowing the rest of the Greek army to retreat. His sacrifice, although militarily useless, became a legend. Thermopylae were not a defeat, but an immortal example of courage in the face of excessive power. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet retreated southwards, waiting for the moment to attack. The Persians advanced, burned Athens, and razed Attica. But the Athenians, under the command of Themistocles, had evacuated the city and concentrated their naval forces in the Strait of Salamis. There, in September 480 BC, the decisive battle was fought. Themistocles, with only 370 triremes, that is, ships with 3 rows of oars, attracted the gigantic Persian fleet to the strait, where their numbers became an obstacle. In the chaos of the narrow waters, the Greek ships maneuvered nimbly, ramming and sinking enemy ships. The sea was covered with debris and bodies. When the sun set, Persian naval power was destroyed, and Xerxes, from his improvised throne on the coast, contemplated the ruin of his army. The victory at Salamis changed the course of the war. The following year, in 479 BC, in 400 BC, the Greeks, led by Pausanias of Sparta, engaged the remaining Persian army at the Battle of Plataea. The hoplite phalanx once again demonstrated its superiority. The Persians were defeated and their general Mardonius fell in combat. Soon after, the Greek fleet won one last victory at Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor. Greece had survived. The most powerful empire in the world had been rejected by an alliance of free cities. The consequences were profound. Athens, whose fleet had been decisive, emerged as the dominant naval power in the Aegean. Sparta retained its military prestige, but the political leadership began to lean towards Attica. In 478 BC, in 400 BC, the Delian League was founded, an alliance of polis under the direction of Athens to maintain the common defense against Persia. Over time, this league would become an instrument of Athenian power, a prelude to new internal tensions. Beyond politics, the Greco-Persian Wars consolidated an idea that the Greeks, despite their differences, shared a common destiny. The victory was not only military, but cultural. Greece had shown that freedom, courage, and intelligence could overcome numbers and tyranny. The union of the polis, although ephemeral, revealed the strength of a collective identity that the Greeks called Hellenism. The echo of those battles lasted for centuries. Marathon symbolized courage, Thermopylae, sacrifice, Salamis, cunning, and Plataea, the final victory. The names of Miltiades, Themistocles, and Leonidas became archetypes of classical heroism. In temples and poems, the Greeks celebrated not only the defeat of the enemy, but the triumph of the free spirit over despotism. The Persians would again be a threat, but they would never again succeed in subduing Greece. In the dust of Marathon, in the Strait of Salamis, and in the mountains of Thermopylae, something more than the independence of a people had been forged, the myth of a civilization that had decided to face fate with the force of its will. The century of Pericles, the golden age of Athens. After the defeat of the Persians, Greece breathed a new air. The cities had saved their freedom, and among them all, Athens emerged as the moral and political victor of the conflict. His fleet had been decisive at Salamis, his leadership had guided the resistance, and his spirit of independence became an example to the whole Hellenic world. In the decades that followed, the city of the goddess Athena rose to unprecedented splendor. The arts, philosophy, architecture, and politics flourished on a scale never seen before. It was the time of Pericles, the strategist and orator who transformed Athens into the spiritual capital of the ancient world, and shaped what historians would later call Greece's Golden Age. The Delian League, founded in 478 BC, in order to maintain the common defense against Persia, it soon became the instrument of Athenian hegemony. Its treasure, originally kept on the island of Delos, was transferred to Athens, and its resources began to finance the city's projects. What had been born as an alliance of equals evolved into an empire under the leadership of Athens. The member polis paid tribute in money or ships, and those who rebelled were forced to return by force. Athenian naval supremacy ensured trade, but it also enforced obedience. In this context of prosperity and power, Pericles became the central figure of Athenian politics. Chosen as a strategist year after year, he ruled with the authority of his intelligence and the magnetism of his word. He defended a revolutionary idea that the greatness of Athens should not be measured by its conquests, but by its culture. Under his leadership, democracy reached its maturity. All free citizens could participate in the ecclesia, the assembly, and decide on laws, wars, and finances. Public offices were chosen by lot or vote, and judges were ordinary citizens. Political equality, though limited to free men, became the pride of the polis. In the famous funeral oration of Pericles, recorded by Thucydides, the leader extolled the uniqueness of Athens, an open, knowledge-loving city in which freedom and law coexisted. He said that Athens was the school of all Greece, a nation that imitated no one because everyone imitated it. His vision was that of a community where art, reason, and justice formed the basis of public life. Athenian art then reached its highest point. On the sacred hill of the Acropolis, Pericles commissioned the reconstruction of the temples destroyed by the Persians and entrusted the direction of the works to Phidias, the greatest sculptor of his time. From this collaboration was born the Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena Parthenos. The temple, with perfect lines and mathematical proportions, was erected as a symbol of the harmony between reason and beauty. Its frieze, with scenes of religious processions and figures of gods and men, represented the union between the human and the divine, between the city and its protector. Other monuments were erected next to the Parthenon: the Propylaea, the Erechtheion, and the Temple of Athena Nike. Every stone, every column, was an affirmation of Athenian confidence in the power of the human spirit. Sculpture, painting, and architecture were not only aesthetic expressions but manifestations of an ideal, kalokagathia, the fusion between the beautiful and the good. Theatre became the purest form of city art. On the slopes of Mount Lycabettus and later in the Theatre of Dionysus, thousands of Athenians attended performances of tragedies and comedies that explored the dilemmas of the human soul. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides staged passions, moral conflicts, and the confrontation between fate and will. In the comedies of Aristophanes, political satire was mixed with popular wit. Theatre was not entertainment, it was civic education, collective reflection on the meaning of life, justice, and power. Thinking also flourished like never before. Philosophers began to question the origin of the cosmos, the nature of virtue, and the organization of society. Anaxagoras, a friend of Pericles, introduced the idea of a nous, a universal mind that ordered the world. The sophists taught rhetoric and critical reasoning, preparing young people for public life. In the streets of the agora, dialogue became a tool of knowledge. The word, which in other cultures was an instrument of power, in Athens was power itself. Everyday life reflected that balance between simplicity and refinement. The houses were modest, but the public spaces were majestic. Citizens spent time debating, exercising, and contemplating. Women, although excluded from political life, played an essential role in the home and in the education of children. Slaves performed much of the manual labor, allowing citizens to participate in civic life. Athenian society was not egalitarian, but it was defined by its faith in collective participation and individual excellence. Under Pericles, Athens also expanded its foreign influence. Its fleet dominated the Aegean, its colonies secured trade routes, and its economy prospered thanks to the tribute of the Delian League. However, that same hegemony aroused resentment among other polis, especially Sparta. Athens' sea power and growing imperialism were beginning to be seen as a threat to Hellenic freedom. The Golden Age had, like all intense light, its shadow. In the year 430 BC, an epidemic devastated Athens as the city endured the Spartan siege during the Peloponnesian War. Thousands died, including Pericles himself. With his death, the balance between ideal and reality that had sustained the most brilliant century of Greek history disappeared. Democracy continued, but without his guidance, it lost its moderation. Political passions replaced dialogue, and ambition replaced the ideal of virtue. For the following decades, Athens would remain the beacon of thought and art, but the splendor of Pericles' century would not be repeated. The Peloponnesian War, the twilight of freedom. Pericles' century ended not with a thunder, but with a slow poisoning. While Athens enjoyed its splendor, its hegemony aroused suspicion in the rest of Greece. The Delian League, conceived as an alliance against Persia, had been transformed into an Athenian empire. The allied polis were treated as subjects, forced to pay tribute and accept Athenian garrisons. Its fleet dominated the sea, its temples glittered with foreign gold, and its culture radiated influence. But in the eyes of Sparta, the proud city of the Peloponnese, this was an intolerable threat. Rivalry between the two powers was inevitable. When it finally broke out, the whole of Greece was plunged into the most devastating war in its history, the Peloponnesian War. The causes were as many as the accumulated wounds. Sparta led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of conservative cities that distrusted Athenian democracy and its imperialism. Athens, for its part, saw in Sparta an obstacle to its expansion. The trigger came in 431 BC. When Corinth and Megara, allies of Sparta, clashed with Athens over commercial and territorial issues. The Spartans demanded that Athens lift its blockade on Megara. Pericles refused. It was the point of no return. The assemblies voted for war, and the Hellenic world was divided into two irreconcilable camps. Pericles' plan was defensive. He knew that Sparta dominated by land and that his army, disciplined and numerous, could devastate Attica. Thus he ordered the peasants to take refuge within the long walls, which linked Athens with its port, Piraeus, ensuring supplies by sea. Meanwhile, the Athenian fleet would attack the coasts of the Peloponnese and cut off Spartan trade routes. But the confinement came at a terrible price. In the second year of the war, a plague broke out within the walls. Within a few months, the disease killed more than a third of the population, including Pericles himself. Without his leadership, prudence disappeared. Democracy became erratic, oscillating between audacity and despair. Over the next few years, the war became a never-ending conflict of sieges, alliances, and betrayals. Athens suffered alternating defeats and victories. In 421 BC, a truce known as the Peace of Nicias was signed, but it lasted only a few years. Athenian ambition was reborn under the command of Alcibiades, a charismatic young man and disciple of Socrates, who convinced the assembly to launch a monumental expedition against Syracuse in Sicily. It promised riches and dominion over the west, but it was an unmitigated disaster. The expedition to Sicily between 415 and 413 BC, it was the greatest catastrophe of Athens. More than 200 ships and 40,000 men set sail for Syracuse, almost none returned. The army was annihilated, the generals captured, and thousands of soldiers ended up enslaved in Sicilian quarries. Athens lost its fleet, its army, and its confidence. From then on, his fall was inevitable. Sparta, supported by the gold of the Persian Empire, ironically, the enemy they had previously fought together, rebuilt its navy and blocked access to Piraeus. In 411 BC, an oligarchic revolution temporarily overthrew Athenian democracy, although it was restored shortly afterwards thanks to soldiers at the front. The war became more cruel and desperate. Fires, executions, looting and betrayals multiplied throughout Greece. The lesser polis were razed, the fields abandoned, the temples desecrated. The Hellenic ideal of reason and balance dissolved under the weight of violence in 404 BC. After more than 27 years of war, Athens was exhausted. With no fleet, no allies, and no food, he surrendered. The Spartans entered the city triumphantly and tore down the long walls, a symbol of their power. Democracy was abolished and replaced by a government of oligarchs known as the 30 Tyrants, imposed by Sparta. For months, Athens lived under terror. Executions, exiles, and confiscations marked the defeat of freedom. However, Sparta's victory was Pyrrhic. The whole of Greece had been ruined, crops destroyed, commerce paralyzed, cities depopulated. Spartan hegemony based on military power did not bring peace, but a fragile rule. The other polis, tired of the Lacedaemonian yoke, soon began to rebel. The war had broken through more than walls. It had destroyed the ideal of Hellenic unity. In the midst of the desolation, Socrates, the philosopher who had seen the rise and fall of his city, was accused of corrupting the youth and sentenced to death in 399 BC. His execution symbolized the end of an era. With him died the voice of dialogue, of free thought, and of rational criticism. Athens had lost the war, and with it its soul. The following years were a labyrinth of shifting alliances. Thebes challenged Sparta, Corinth took up arms, and Persia, ever present in the shadows, took advantage of the divisions to impose its influence. No polis would succeed in dominating the others in a lasting way. The Greek world, fragmented and weakened, was exposed to new powers that awaited in the north. The Peloponnesian War not only destroyed cities, destroyed an idea. Athenian democracy, Spartan discipline, and Hellenic fraternity were consumed in the fire of a war between brothers. Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world. In the north of Greece, beyond Mount Olympus, stood a kingdom that for centuries had been looked upon with disdain by the southern polis, Macedonia. Considered barbarian by the Athenians and Spartans, it was a land of mountains, shepherds, and warriors. But in the 4th century BC, under the political and military genius of Philip II, Macedonia became the most formidable power in the Hellenic world. Its disciplined army, heavy cavalry, and diplomatic strategy made it the dominant force in Greece. And from that kingdom, in the year 356 BC, a man destined to change the course of history would be born. Alexander, son of Philip and Olympias of Epirus, later known as Alexander the Great. From his childhood, Alexander was educated for glory. His mother instilled in him the belief that he was descended from Achilles, his father the ambition to unify the Greeks under a single command, and his teacher was none other than Aristotle, who instructed him in philosophy, science, and politics. From that education emerged a young man with a brilliant mind, an indomitable spirit, and an almost divine will. He loved Homer's poetry, admired his master's reason, and dreamed of conquering the known world. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander was barely 20 years old. He inherited a powerful kingdom but surrounded by enemies. The Greek polis, believing that a boy could not maintain control, rebelled. In a show of daring and speed, Alexander marched south, took Thebes by force, and razed it to the ground. His brutality was a message. Greece was united under his authority, and anyone who challenged his power would be destroyed. Athens, terrified, submitted without resistance. With the League of Corinth, Alexander proclaimed himself supreme commander of the Greeks to fulfill his father's dream, the conquest of the Persian Empire. In the spring of 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont with an army of 40,000 men. Before setting foot in Asia, he threw a spear towards the coast and declared that he was taking the continent as a gift from the gods. On the shore, he visited the tomb of Achilles and offered sacrifices to the hero he had always admired. He was beginning a campaign that would take him further than any general in history. The first confrontation took place on the Granicus River in Asia Minor. The Persians were waiting for him with a large force, but Alexander attacked them immediately, crossing the river under a hail of arrows. His cavalry, the Macedonian companions, broke through the enemy lines and won a lightning victory. That battle demonstrated his style, speed, audacity, and absolute faith in his destiny. After liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor, Alexander marched into the heart of the empire. In the year 333 BC, he faced King Darius III at the Battle of Isso in Cilicia. The Persians, much more numerous, occupied a narrow terrain between the mountains and the sea. Alexander, at the head of his cavalry, attacked directly the center of the enemy army. Darius, terrified, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his family and treasure. The triumph at Isso consolidated the myth of an invincible general. From there, Alexander advanced towards Phoenicia. The coastal cities surrendered one after another, except for Tyre, which held out for 7 months. Alexander ordered a dam to be built over the sea to take it by storm. When the city fell, its inhabitants were executed or sold into slavery. It was the demonstration that nothing could stop him. He then marched to Egypt, where he was received as a liberator. In Memphis, the priests crowned him as pharaoh and proclaimed him the son of the god Amun. In the seaward desert, the oracle confirmed his divine origin. Alexander no longer saw himself as just a king. He believed himself to be chosen by the gods to rule the world. From Egypt, he left for the heart of Asia. In 331 BC, in the 1st century BC, the decisive battle was fought on the plains of Gaugamela. Darius assembled a gigantic army with war chariots and elephants on a terrain prepared for his advantage. Alexander, outnumbered, executed a brilliant maneuver. He feigned an attack from the flank and opened a breach in the enemy center. Riding to the front, he charged directly towards the Persian king, who once again fled. The victory was total. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell without resistance. In the palace of Persepolis, Alexander beheld the treasures of a 1,000-year-old empire and, according to tradition, allowed the city to be burned down as revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens. With the fall of Persia, Alexander was master of the known world, but his ambition knew no bounds. He continued eastward, through the deserts of Iran and the mountains of the Hindu Kush. In Bactria and Sogdiana, regions that today correspond to Afghanistan and Central Asia, he faced fierce resistance. He founded more than 70 cities that bore his name, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt, and established colonies that mixed Greek soldiers with local populations. He believed that the fusion of East and West was the path to universal unity. To cement this union, he married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. In the year 327 BC, in 400 BC, he crossed the Indus River and entered India, where he confronted King Poros at the Battle of Hydaspes. Despite the use of war elephants, Alexander won again, but his soldiers, exhausted from years of campaigning, refused to go ahead. At the Hyphasis River, the army stopped. Alexander, furious and disappointed, agreed to return. He returned to Babylon, where he planned new expeditions, to Arabia, perhaps to the western Mediterranean. However, his body could no longer withstand fatigue. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander fell ill after a banquet in Babylon. Within a few days, the fever consumed him. According to the chronicles, when the generals asked him to whom he would give his empire, Magnus replied, "The strongest." Alexander the Great died at the age of 32, without a legitimate heir, leaving behind an empire that stretched from Greece to the Punjab. His death was the beginning of the chaos. The generals who had accompanied him, the Diadochi, vied for power, dividing the empire into independent kingdoms. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Cassander in Macedonia, and Lysimachus in Thrace. But even though his empire fragmented, the world would never be the same again. Wherever he went, Alexander founded cities, spread the Greek language, art, science, and philosophy. Hellenic culture merged with Eastern culture, giving rise to a new era, Hellenism. To the Greeks, Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was the embodiment of the heroic ideal, the last of the sons of Achilles, a man who defied human limits. His life combined the ambition of the warrior with the vision of the philosopher. For some, he was a tyrant, for others, a god. The truth is that his legacy transformed the ancient world. In the centuries that followed, the Romans would revere him as a model of greatness, and his figure would inspire emperors and adventurers for millennia. Hellenistic Greece, the legacy of the Diadochi. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, his body had not yet cooled, and the largest empire in history was already tearing itself apart. There was no legitimate heir, only an unborn child and a brother incapable of ruling. His army, accustomed to following the will of a single man, suddenly found itself without a guide. 13-year conquests were crumbling, and the dream of a unified world under Greek culture became a battlefield. The generals who had shared in his glory became enemies. They would be known as the Diadochi, the successors. The first dispute was over the body of the conqueror. According to tradition, Ptolemy, one of his closest generals, stole the coffin on the way to Macedonia and took it to Egypt. There, in Alexandria, Alexander would rest forever, wrapped in gold and crystal, becoming a symbol of lost greatness. Meanwhile, his former companions divided the remains of his empire. General Perdiccas tried to maintain the unit but was killed in a revolt. Then began a long period of wars among the Diadochi, which would last more than 4 decades. From that chaos arose 3 great kingdoms: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy, the Seleucid Empire, created by Seleucus in Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia, heiress of Alexander's homeland. Each of these kingdoms retained the Greek language, administration, and culture, but mixed them with Eastern traditions, creating a new world, Hellenism. The reign of Ptolemy I Soter was the most stable and brilliant. From Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander at the mouth of the Nile, he ruled an empire rich in agriculture, trade, and knowledge. Ptolemy understood that the true heritage of his former king was not war, but culture. He ordered the construction of the Museum of Alexandria, an institution dedicated to research and wisdom, and the library, which came to collect hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls from all over the ancient world. Mathematicians such as Euclid, astronomers such as Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed that the earth revolved around the sun, and poets such as Callimachus and Theocritus worked there. Alexandria became the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean, the place where Greek thought merged with Egyptian and Babylonian science. Further east, Seleucus I Nicator established his power over the vast lands of Asia, from Syria to India. His empire, the Seleucid, was the most extensive and difficult to govern. He founded numerous cities, many named Antioch in honor of his father, which functioned as administrative and commercial centers. They spoke Greek, worshipped the gods of Olympus, and built temples with Doric columns alongside ziggurats and oriental palaces. The Seleucids tried to maintain unity through politics and marriage, but their territory was so diverse that rebellion was constant. In time, Babylon, Persia, and the eastern satrapies regained their independence. In Macedonia and Greece, the family of Antigonus the One-Eyed and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes managed to retain control. His power, however, was never absolute. The Greek polis continued to exist, although under Macedonian influence. Athens, no longer in its classical splendor, remained a cultural center, and new philosophical currents flourished in its schools. The Stoicism of Zeno of Citium, which preached serenity in the face of fate, and Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, which taught how to seek happiness through moderation and friendship. It was a less heroic time, but more human. Thought had shifted from the agora to the soul. Hellenistic expansion was not only political, but also cultural and economic. Greek became the lingua franca from Egypt to Bactria. Artists began to depict more realistic faces with emotions and movement. The sculptures no longer idealized immobile heroes, but men and women with gestures of pain, desire, or tenderness. The cities were filled with theaters, gymnasiums, and temples dedicated to the Greek gods, but also to Oriental divinities reinterpreted with Hellenic forms. The world had become cosmopolitan. Trade flourished like never before. From Alexandria, ships loaded with wheat, papyrus, wine, and perfumes departed for the ports of the Mediterranean. In Asia, land routes connected Antioch with India and China. Greek merchants introduced coins, systems of weights and measures, and construction techniques. Caravans carried silk, spices, and gems, while ideas traveled along with goods. Hellenism was, in essence, the first attempt at cultural globalization in history. But under that appearance of splendor, political tensions persisted. Hellenistic kingdoms were absolute monarchies ruled by kings who proclaimed themselves Alexander's heirs and, in some cases, demigods. The freedom of the old polis disappeared. Wars between the dynasties were constant and populations suffered under taxes and conscriptions. The Greek ideal of citizenship gave way to courtly obedience. Hellenic greatness had been transferred from the citizen to the sovereign. Even so, the fusion between East and West produced an unprecedented cultural synthesis. In Egypt, the Greek gods were identified with the Egyptians, Zeus with Amun, Aphrodite with Isis. In Asia, Greek art influenced the Buddhist temples of India and gave rise to the Greco-Buddhist style of Gandhara, where Buddha was depicted with Hellenic features. In the sciences, Hellenistic astronomers measured the circumference of the Earth, calculated solar distances, and drew the first accurate maps of the world during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. In the 1st century BC, Hellenism reached its maximum splendor, but in the shadow of this greatness grew a new power that would soon claim its place in history: Rome. At first, the Romans admired Greek culture, copied its art, architecture, and philosophy. However, behind that admiration was hidden ambition. As the Hellenistic kingdoms were weakened by internal wars, Rome was advancing. In 168 BC, in 400 BC, the Battle of Pydna sealed the fate of Macedonia. The Roman army defeated King Perseus, and Greece came under Roman control. A few years later, the Seleucid Empire was dismembered, and Egypt, though nominally independent, became a Roman protectorate. With the arrival of the legions, the Hellenic world lost its political independence, but its spirit survived. The Greek language remained that of knowledge, science, and diplomacy. The Romans adopted the gods of Olympus, translated Homer, and studied Aristotle. The cities founded by Alexander continued to prosper, and Alexandria, with its library and museum, remained the beacon of knowledge until its destruction centuries later. The philosophical legacy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Between the 5th and 4th centuries BC. As Athens lived its days of political and artistic splendor, a new force began to transform the history of Greece: philosophical thought. Until then, the Greeks had sought to explain the world through myths and the will of the gods. But in the streets of the Agora, between temples and schools, a silent revolution emerged: the desire to understand the universe not by faith, but by reason. Philosophers, literally friends of knowledge, turned curiosity into science and reflection into virtue. Among all of them, 3 names defined the basis of Western civilization: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The figure of Socrates was the turning point between myth and reason. He did not write books or found a school, but he changed the way men thought about themselves. He was born in Athens, the son of a sculptor and a midwife, and lived as an ordinary citizen. During the Peloponnesian Wars, he served as a hoplite, showing courage and discipline. But his real battle was intellectual. Walking through the squares and markets, he questioned everyone he met: politicians, poets, artisans, young people. His method, based on questions and answers, became known as maieutic, the art of giving birth to ideas. He believed that truth should not be taught, but discovered through dialogue. Socrates rejected the empty wisdom of the sophists, who were paid to teach rhetoric and persuasion. For him, knowledge should not serve to dominate, but to live justly. He taught that evil came from ignorance and that virtue was knowledge. His insistence on questioning customs, laws, and religion made him enemies. In an Athens exhausted after the war, his figure became uncomfortable, a man who defied tradition, who said that the true duty of the citizen was to think. In 399 BC, he was accused of corrupting youth and impiety. In his trial, taken up by his disciple Plato, Socrates defended himself without recanting. He preferred to die rather than give up his search for truth. He drank hemlock, surrounded by his students, and became a symbol of intellectual integrity, a man who preferred death rather than betray his conscience. From his death was born one of the most enduring schools in history, Plato's Academy. Plato, who belonged to a noble family, had witnessed the political instability of Athens and the injustice committed against his master. From this trauma arose his vision of the world: a separation between the sensible world, which he considered changing and imperfect, and the world of ideas, which was supposed to be eternal and true. According to Plato, everything we see is nothing more than a shadow of a higher reality. In his most famous dialogue, The Republic, he imagined a society governed by philosophers, the only ones capable of understanding the good and justice. Plato considered education to be the path to virtue. In his famous Myth of the Cave, he described the chained men who only see shadows on a wall and believe that this is reality. The philosopher, when he frees himself, ascends towards the light and contemplates the true world, but when he returns to liberate others, he is misunderstood and rejected. The metaphor represented not only the duty of the sage, but the destiny of every thinker who defies collective ignorance. His influence extended far beyond his time. He founded the Academy in Athens, considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. There he brought together mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers to discuss the nature of the soul, the cosmos, and knowledge. Plato united reason with spirituality, abstract thought with ethics. His work, written in the form of dialogues, preserved the voice of Socrates and prepared the ground for the most systematic mind of antiquity, Aristotle. Aristotle, born in Stagira in northern Greece, came to Athens as a young man and studied for 20 years at Plato's academy. Although he admired his master, he departed from him on essential points. He rejected the idea of a world of ideas separate from the real one. For Aristotle, reality was here in the concrete things which had to be observed and analyzed. With him, empirical thinking was born, knowledge based on experience. He classified everything that existed: plants, animals, emotions, forms of government. He created formal logic, the basis of scientific reasoning. Where Plato had looked up at the sky, Aristotle looked at the earth. After Plato's death, he founded his own school, the Lyceum, where he taught walking with his disciples in the gardens, hence the name Peripatetics. His curiosity knew no bounds. He studied astronomy, biology, physics, politics, and art. He considered that human happiness depended on the fulfillment of virtue and balance, the mesotes, a term that sought to represent the right mean between extremes. His thought ranged from morality to metaphysics, from the theory of the soul to rhetoric. In 343 BC, Aristotle was called to Macedonia to tutor a young prince, Alexander, son of Philip II. For several years, he taught him history, ethics, and philosophy, instilling in him a love for Greek culture. When Alexander set out on his conquest of the world, he carried with him the influence of his master, the idea that reason and knowledge were as powerful as the sword. Aristotle's work marked the beginning of science as a rational discipline. His observations on anatomy, physics, and logic would be studied for 2 millennia. For the medievals, their thought was the basis of knowledge. For the Renaissance, the door to modern knowledge. His vision of the cosmos, composed of a motionless Earth surrounded by celestial spheres, dominated Western thought until Copernicus. Even his notion of virtue as a habit is still alive in contemporary ethics. The heritage of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle transcended Greece. All three created a system of thought that shaped Western civilization: the moral duty of the individual, the rational search for truth, and the logical organization of knowledge. As empires fell, his ideas survived in manuscripts copied in Alexandria, in Roman libraries, and later in medieval monasteries. His legacy was more powerful than any army, the conviction that man can understand the world with his mind and that justice, virtue, and wisdom are the pillars of every society. In the silent agora where Socrates was condemned, in the crumbling walls of the academy, and in the ruins of the Lyceum covered by the dust of time, the echo of that intellectual revolution still resounds. Greece had lost its independence, but it had conquered something that no empire could take away from it: thought.